September 21st, 1191. Arsuf, on the blistered coast of the Levant. 49 knights lay dead within 15 minutes. But it wasn't the Saracen sword that gutted them. It was the quarrel, fired silently through smoke, launched with a snap from 200 yards away. What the Templars' records disguised, what Richard the Lionheart's scribes erased, was the rising terror in every knight's gut, not of open battle, but of the lowborn crossbowmen hidden in the scrub and shadows, cutting down nobility without honor, without challenge, without warning. The chivalric code cracked that day, not under a cavalry charge, but under bolts that punched through plate, pierced the eye, shattered the spine. Before we continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone. They called them cowards, murderers, kinslayers. But no insult dulled the barbed truth. Crossbowmen were feared because they changed the rules. At Arsuf, it wasn't just knights who died. It was centuries of ceremony. The knight's code demanded eye contact in battle, a fair charge, a visible enemy. But Bolduc of Marseille, a peasant's son barely 20, killed 7 mounted knights from behind a thorn bush, reloading with quick, practiced fingers soaked in another man's blood. The 4th bolt struck Sir Gerald of Kent in the throat, unhelmeted for air, talking to his squire when steel split his larynx and dropped him gargling in the salt sand. Gerald's mistress, Eleanor of Brienne, miscarried the next day, a fact never included in the muster rolls. What began as a skirmish broke into chaos, not because the Saracens pushed, but because the Frankish nobles lost their minds over one truth. No lineage, no armor, no oath could stop a quarrel once loosed. The church called it heresy. The Pope himself, Innocent II, declared at the Second Lateran Council in 1139 that any man using a crossbow against a fellow Christian was damned. Not simply condemned, damned. One weapon, forbidden by God and feared by kings, but the ban only amplified its appeal, especially among mercenaries and rulers with too much ambition and too little conscience. By 1191, Richard's own captains were recruiting Genoese crossbowmen in secret, slipping them extra coin and wine in the dead of night. They were housed apart, fed apart, and when interrogations were needed, quiet ones outside the scrolls, they were used without ceremony. At Tyre, 3 weeks after Arsuf, 2 crossbowmen were sent to silence a captured spy. The bolts didn't just kill. They pinned the man's corpse to the chapel door like a message. No trial, no priest. Just the clatter of wood and metal and a smear of blood running down stained oak. Knights pretended to spit on them. But the same knights sent squires in the dark, offering coin-laced parchment and whispered targets they dared not name aloud. But beneath the veils of scorched silk tents and clinking goblets, the fear was more personal, more primal. Crossbowmen were often lowborn. Sons of coopers, foundlings, former thieves promised pardon if they killed for crown and coin. They had no bloodline to disgrace, no crest to tarnish. And that terrified the nobility. At the siege of Acre, in the spring of 1190, Sir Raymond de Vaux lost 2 brothers within an hour, each felled by quarrels from a shadowed tower. The shooter, a woman, Mariette of Toulouse, 23, disguised in a leather hood, her wrists pale from rope burns. She had been a servant before her escape, trained by mercenaries after witnessing her master's throat cut with a kitchen knife. Now she killed like a ghost, and soon her name whispered through English and French camps like a curse. No knight could duel a ghost. No armor guarded against vengeance with a trigger. And when Sir Godfrey de Montluc fell to her bolt beneath a banner of truce, the scandal exploded. because Mariette had once warmed his bed. A peasant woman turned assassin, crossbow in hand, driven not by flag or faith, but the cruel intimacy of old betrayal. The chronicles never named her, but ask the veterans at night, and they'd mutter of her aim and the scent of rosewater on the wind before the killing began. The hatred grew sharper in winter. January 1192, the ruins of Durham Fortress. 16 bodies rotted outside the walls in the frostbite wind. 4 knights, 12 crossbowmen. But only the knights had names carved into oak markers. The crossbowmen were dumped in a trench, burned with the waste. What wasn't recorded was why. A botched ambush. Sir Theobald of Anjou, 32, ordered a flanking maneuver at dusk. Crossbowmen led the way, bolts loosed without command, striking a bannered unit of German allies. 3 barons died. In camp that night, their commander was dragged from his tent while sleeping. No trial, no pardon. The men who disappeared him wore crusader cloaks and smelled of frankincense. But the real story twisted deeper. Theobald himself had funded the shipment of those crossbows, hidden beneath barrels of cured fish off the coast of Acre. A ledger now missing. A dockhand strangled in a brothel cellar. And Lady Ismene of Flanders, Theobald's confidant and cousin, was seen boarding a departing ship with a bloodied satchel clutched to her chest. Crossbow bolts inside, initials etched into their shafts. There was talk of a threat, written in Latin, slipped under tents before the ambush. For every lie of nobility, a bolt from the mud. The campaign turned darker after the blood at Durham froze. In the weeks that followed, whispers twisted through the frost-bitten camps like smoke through a battlefield wound. Names half-spoken, secrets half-buried. In February, outside Jaffa, a royal tent burned under a moonless sky. The blaze killed 6, including Lord Emmerich of Poitou's favored courier. The cause was said to be spilled oil, but the truth, spoken only by the dying under morphia and wine, blamed 3 quarrels in the night, shot through canvas. One piercing the courier's chest as he clutched a sealed message marked with the Lionheart's crest. The letter never reached Richard. Some claimed it revealed infidel sympathizers among his commanders. Others whispered it contained names, noble names, of those using Saracen trade vessels to smuggle crossbows across the blockade. That same week, Sir Jean of Brissac hanged himself with his own sword belt, mouth foaming from hemlock. They found no note, just a bolt stub jammed in his writing desk, branded with the sigil of the Toulouse widow, Mariette, a ghost from the mud, still killing. And as the fires of Jaffa died to ash, one truth planted itself deep into the marrow of every knight left alive. Honor, like flesh, cannot stop steel. And every oath sworn in candlelight could be severed in silence by a peasant's pull of cord and wood, without a name, without a prayer, and with no justice but vengeance from the shadows. Spring 1192. The siege lines around Ascalon swelled with heat and rot, baked under a sun that refused mercy. Crossbowmen now numbered in the hundreds, mercenaries from Pisan docks, Sicilian prisons, and the ravaged fields of Aquitaine. They slept in ditches, pissed on chapel stones, and carried secrets carved into their gear. Codes for kills, initials of marks, notched grips for every noble throat they'd ruined. One such man, Lucien Artois, called the Worm for how he slithered between units with whispers and offers, delivered death for both coin and confession. He was spotted in the company of Lady Agnes de Merville, widow of 2 knights shot by quarrel, now rumored to warm the beds of their killer. A knight's lover turned arms dealer. Her wagons carried grain above, black market crossbows below. Their affair ended not with a kiss, but a hanging. Agnes was found garroted with Lucien's bowstring, her tongue severed, her body posed in prayer. Lucien vanished. Some say he joined a Saracen unit. Others claim he sold names, Christian names, to the enemy. What remained was the record of 5 knights dead in a week, all poisoned, all formerly tied to Agnes's court. The crossbow had become more than feared. It had become a herald of treason, revenge, and forbidden lust. No longer a soldier's tool, it was a message. And the message was clear. There was no honor left in this war, only secrets and steel, and the shadows where both hid until it was too late. By May, Ascalon's red dust was soaked with more than blood. It clung to scandal. On the 3rd day of Pentecost, Sir Almeric de Rochefort was found naked atop the battlements, throat slit ear to ear, tongue nailed to a crossbow bolt at his feet. Hours earlier, he'd been seen leaving the tent of Brother Antoine, a Hospitaller chaplain and Almeric's long-rumored lover. In the camp ledger, both names were erased with fresh ink. The next morning, Antoine vanished. A solitary crossbow was found near the shattered altar, quarrel lodged in the eye socket of a stone saint. Witnesses were gagged, silence ordered. But the gossip spread like rot, whispers of holy vows broken by fleshly longing, and vengeance exacted by jealous rivals wielding peasant tools. Some claimed Almeric had planned to defect to the Saracens with Antoine, trading secrets for sanctuary. Others said the weapon had been delivered by a woman in white robes speaking Italian, her sleeves stinking of wet ash and myrrh. No chronicles mention her. But one squire, years later in a tavern near Marseille, swore he saw her gripping Almeric's heart in her left hand, as if weighing its sins. The crossbowmen, once buried outside city walls like plague dogs, now walked openly, paid openly, and killed openly. And the knights, armored in shame and suspicion, marched on, each bolt in the air a reminder not just of death, but of what history refused to name. Lust, betrayal, and the war no oath could sanctify. June 1192. The Battle of Arsuf had faded to memory, but its wounds festered in the minds of the survivors. In a ravine north of Gaza, a final skirmish burned itself into oblivion and into history's oubliette. 32 corpses, 15 of them knights, were discovered by a shepherd boy. Flies drank from slit throats. No coins on the bodies, no seals, no colors. Only one clue. Every knight's helmet had been nailed shut from the inside. Crossbow bolts hung from their eye slits, symbols, not kills. It was a ritual, a reckoning. Lucien Artois' name was carved into one shaft, and Mariette's rose sigil stained another with dried blood. Had they returned? Had they worked together? One survivor, a mute squire named Eloy, was found days later trembling in a cave, clutching parchment with 6 names, each of them executed later for treason. The church said it was a purge. The generals claimed it was Saracen trickery. But in the brothels and barracks, the truth was whispered raw. The war had always bled from more than swords. It was who you loved, who you betrayed, who you paid to vanish in the dark. And the crossbow was no longer the tool of cowards. It was the voice of the silenced, screaming justice from the shadows no knight dared claim. The war ended at Acre 4 months later. But some say if you pass those ravines in summer, you can still hear the bolts humming through the heat and smell rosewater on the wind. Autumn 1192. Before the knights boarded ships for home, before Richard was captured in a German forest and the Holy Land fell again into smoke, one last ledger appeared. Smuggled in a reed case, carried by a blind monk from Tyre to Messina, its ink warped by seawater. its wax seals broken by nervous hands. It contained 16 names: lords, commanders, lovers, spies, all marked by quarrel. One name, Mariette's, was circled thrice, and beneath it, a phrase in Latin, lex occulta, manus in tenebris. The hidden law, the hand in darkness. No one confessed to writing it. And yet that winter, as snow coated the stone keeps of Europe, those listed began to die. Riding accidents, fevers, duels with no witnesses. One was found in a fountain with a quarrel buried in his groin. Another drowned in wine, throat bloated, lips burned. The weapon was gone, but the message remained, etched in flesh and scandal alike. The chronicles speak of treaties signed, relics returned, honor barely preserved. But those pages lie. Because what ended was not a war. It was a reckoning begun by peasants, carried out by ghosts, and finished by forgotten hands pulling strings of wood and gut in the dark. The cathedrals still sing for victory. But the shadows remember who fired first, and why. Winter passed its last breath over Europe, and the names continued to vanish. In Normandy, beside a frozen stream, the body of Sir Danel of Chartres was found impaled to a tree with 3 bolts, each one carved with a different confession. One read, "For her screams," another, "For his lies," the final, "For the silence." Danel had once presided over the court that condemned 40 crossbowmen to death by fire for cowardice and impiety. That verdict never made it to the papal annals, and now neither would his burial. Nearby, tied to a stump, was a woman's shoe, clean, untouched by snow. The final death came that spring. Lady Ismen of Flanders, long presumed drowned after Durham, reappeared at a monastic sanctuary in Avignon with a wound along her ribs and a scroll of parchment fused to her torso in blood. The scroll held only 13 words. "You crowned cowards villains, but they bled for truths you feared to name." She died moments later, and with her, a veil came down, not of peace, but of silence. The chronicles muted their ink. The noble houses sealed their memories, yet the bolt had already lodged itself in history's throat. It had been drawn by outcasts, courtesans, killers, and all who remembered. So when you next walk the crumbling halls of crusader strongholds or pass beneath stained glass saints who never fought, listen. Beneath every hymn, every oath, every falsified page, the hiss of the crossbow lingers. Justice whispered from the mud, where even chivalry bleeds. They say history is written by the victors, but in the blood-soaked shadow of the Crusades, much was written by those who were never meant to speak. The crossbowmen carved truth not in ink, but in bone, in scandal, in the breathless space between confession and execution. They were forbidden, not because they were weak, but because they made the noble bleed like common men. No duel, no trumpet call. Just the sudden puncture of power, collapsing centuries of pageantry in a single silent moment. Lovers betrayed, scribes bribed, saints desecrated. The coward's weapon revealed too much. How brittle were oaths, how cheap were bloodlines, how fragile even kings before a quarrel loosed by the wronged. And so the chronicles buried them. The priests damned them, the knights scorned them, but the memory lingered, because every empire that followed looked over its shoulder for the soundless killer in the crowd. Not a warrior, not a soldier, just a hand in the dark, drawing back string and fate, whispering truths no throne dared speak aloud. The crossbow did not end chivalry. It unmasked it, and in its silence we hear what the scrolls refused: the groan of armor splitting, the gasp of scandal exposed, and the breathless truths left behind by the nameless dead. The whispers never stopped. In the decades that followed, as Europe marched again to war, as new kings crowned themselves in rooms still smelling faintly of rot and oil, no knight forgot the terror that once came from the bush line, not with banners, but with breath held and trigger drawn. By 1205, manuscripts in Occitan and Latin began to reference shadow bands, sagittari damnati, crossbowmen exiled by state yet sheltered by secrets. They were seen at the fringes of sieges, never sworn, never named, always paid in silence. One legend tells of a lone shooter at the siege of Constantinople whose quarrel felled a Venetian doge mid-prayer. No siege tower breached, no battle hymn sung, just blood and disbelief in the marble nave. Another records a letter intercepted in Lyon, unsigned except for a sketch of a rose pierced by bolt, demanding shipment of 200 crossbows for correction, not conquest. The weapon transcended war. It became vendetta. It became memory. And long after the banners rotted, the scrolls smudged, and the graves eroded beneath ivy and time, one truth endured where the pious dared not speak. Fear speaks loudest in silence, and the crossbowmen never needed a name to make history bleed. So the story closes here, not with a treaty signed or a relic returned, but with silence, the kind that suffocates in cathedral crypts and festers in the hearts of the long-dead wronged. The crossbowmen never got a statue, never earned a hymn. Yet without them, the lies would have lasted longer. Each quarrel loosed from brush or scaffold was more than murder. It was indictment, against rank, against ritual, against the belief that power made one untouchable. In the end, what nobles feared was not death, but being brought low without ceremony, without witness, by hands they'd never deigned to see coming. The war bled into quiet. The chronicles etched their selective truths, but beneath weathered walls, behind frescoes scrubbed clean, in every shadowed cloister where footsteps echo too soft, they remain. The crossbowmen, the heretics, the avengers, the ghost-handed truth-tellers who taught every armored man one final law. Banners fall, bloodline breaks, but a bolt never forgets its mark. And still, no matter how many names rotted unspoken in ledgers, or how many bolts rusted beneath old stones, the legacy endures. Not in honor, but in the hush before the kill. In Ravenden Abbey, an unmarked tomb rests beneath the apse, older than the masonry allows, sealed not with prayer, but with resin and iron. No name, no crest, only a single quarrel embedded in the lid, its flight etched with 4 words. We remember who bled. Clerics walk past it daily without glance. Tourists never hear of it. But once a year, on the eve of the sainted feast of martyrs unnamed, red petals are scattered upon it by a woman in mourning black. No one claims to know her. No one dares ask. History closed its mouth, but the dirt never does. Because the crossbowman is not merely a phantom of crime or war or betrayal, but the grim echo of truth itself, loaded in silence, loosed in defiance, and landing where pride hoped it never would. And for every chronicler who skipped their story, a bolt waits, still taut, still trembling, still aimed, as if history's final confession is yet to come. So next time you hear a historian exalt the noble sacrifices of the Crusades, or a guide proclaim the glory of a knight's charge beneath holy banners, remember what was hidden behind each tale. A quarrel in the dark, a body without justice, a kiss that turned to betrayal, ink that never touched the page. The crossbowman was not a footnote. He was the silence between lines, the truth beneath gold leaf, the question no priest dared ask. And though time dirties names and empires forget, the bolt remains, not rusted yet, not spent, still waiting, lodged deep in history's throat, waiting for breath, waiting, perhaps, for yours. Because when all banners have burned, when saints crumble beneath moss and monarchs sink into their own bloodied myths, it is the bolt, not the crown, that endures. The crossbowmen, nameless and despised, slit history's throat in flickering silence, leaving truth to drain into cursed soil. No marble relief bears their faces, no scroll sanctifies their creed, and still they rise, in every smoke-wreathed memory of war halls, in every soldier's nightmare of breathless death. Their legacy is not glory, it is reckoning, felt in the twitch of a priest's eye at whispered heresy, in a general's silence before naming a traitor, in the lover's shiver when recalling whose hands last touched forbidden arms. The crossbowmen vanished, yes, but not their aim. It lives in every silence after a lie. So next time your breath stills in cathedral air, or your eyes linger too long on a blank grave, ask yourself, do you hear it? That hiss, that hum, that whisper in the dark. They remember, and the bolt never forgets. And thus the final truth settles unmarked into the earth. It was never about the battlefield, nor the holy city, nor the crowns forged in divine pretense. It was always about fear, the fear that the mighty could fall not in war songs, but in shadows. So when the crossbowman fades from scripture and sculpture alike, know that it was not by accident. He was erased. Because what he represented could not be pardoned. Retribution without permission, justice without hierarchy, love betrayed without penance. He was every oath broken by blood, every noble cut down without fame, every secret that dared to bleat in the dark. While knights rode to acclaim, his truth rode in silence, and the chronicles might deny him still. But the wind remembers, the soil remembers, and the grave, pierced by a rusted bolt, bears silent witness to a final, forgotten creed. No matter what history buries, the dead still tell their tales, one quarrel at a time. So ends the tale not of cowards, but of exiles who turned silence into vengeance. The crossbowman did not vanish. He became shadow, embedded in the fear priests never confessed, in the resolve of every lover who kissed a killer and lied to the dawn. The church sings of saints, the crown pens oaths, but beneath every anthem lies the truth they hunted, hidden in muck and wrath and the sigh before string snaps. Their bolts were not tools of war, they were questions. What lies had to die to make kingdoms rise? What secrets bled before the banners ever flew? And what justice, dark and unblessed, made nobility tremble even in prayer? The last quarrel was loosed long ago, yet its echo still stirs the ash, still strains in the silence between verses sung too loudly over bones not yet cold. Listen closer, it is still flying. So if ever you find yourself gazing at a rusted bolt embedded in a crumbling fortress wall, or standing before a nameless grave tucked in some forgotten nave, know this: you are not alone. The hands that loosed that quarrel once trembled with fury unspoken, love denied, truth unrecorded. They killed not for glory, but for memory, for revenge, for justice twisted and warped and never offered in daylight. And as long as war is waged in songs and history fed in lies, their silence will scream beneath every cathedral stone. The crossbowman lives, not in legend, but in every breathless moment when power hesitates, when guilt gnaws at the garlanded, and when the wind brushes your neck as if tracing the path of a bolt still flying. Remember this and speak it, for the chronicles will not. Some truths never needed parchment. only aim. And so the crusade of whispers ends, not with glory, but with the last breath of men the chronicles tried to forget. On some nights, when the moon is hidden and campfires burn low, warriors still tell the story of the ones who struck from silence. The crossbowmen, not soldiers, not saints, just hands shaped by hunger and grief, fingers calloused not by prayer beads but by string and blood. They were cursed, damned, discarded, yet they stayed. Long after kings turned to dust and knights to legend, their quarrels remain, embedded in stone, in sin, in the history that sighs behind every lie of honor. Because it was never about cowardice, it was about truth, drawn taut, loosed in vengeance, and waiting still in the dark for a name to speak it.